Hi to all those connected with us today. My name is Andrea Calle, Project Manager at the Instituto de Ciencia Política Hernán Echavarría Olózaga, an independent and not partisan Colombian think tank that promotes liberal democracy and the defense of economic freedoms. It is a pleasure to welcome you all to another session of our webinar series, developed in collaboration with the Australian Embassy here in Colombia. In this series, we are discussing about China foreign policy, its bilateral relations with countries as Australia and Colombia, the opportunities and risks it presents, and all the related topics. Today, we are honored to have with us Dr. Gatra Priyandita, a senior analyst in the Cyber Technology and Security Program at the Australian Strategy Policy Institute. His primary research focuses on cyber diplomacy and the military application of emerging technologies. He also provides insights into foreign and defense policy issues in Southeast Asia. Dr. Priyandita will be discussing hybrid threats in the Indo Pacífico with a special focus on information technology and cybersecurity. Welcome, Dr. Priyandita.
Thank you, Andrea. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you very much for being here with us. And I think we can start with the first question. To begin, would like to provide some context to our audience. So could you please explain what is meant by a hybrid threat?
It basically refers to coercive practices, primarily employed by states, but also non-state actors, that are pursued just short of the conventional warfare as a means of undermining the target, but also securing sometimes economic and strategic objectives. They sort of operate within what is often called as the gray zone. And the term hybrid threats itself has often been conflated with things like gray zone conflicts and so on. The gray zone is this area between peace and war. Common method, for example, frequent example of hybrid threats, for example, might be the little green men used by Russia to occupy parts of Ukraine prior to the current war since 2022. So a lot of these green men were not tied to the Russian state formally. They were seen as sort of militia, so they had no direct affiliation publicly with the Russian state. So it provides the Russian government, for example, with a degree of space, right? They can say, we are not pursuing anything in eastern Ukraine, even though they are. China has been doing the same thing in the Indo Pacífic, particularly in the South China Sea, where they have been deploying maritime militia. So these are Chinese fishing vessels that are used to occupy claimed waters in the South China Sea. These are not just fishing vessels, though. They're heavily armed fishing vessels, and they're huge, and they intimidate the smaller coast guards and navies in Southeast Asia. Increasingly in the 21st century, we are seeing the incorporation of ICTs into methods for the pursuit of hybrid threats. We see information operations, for example, attempts to use social media as well as the internet more broadly to undermine foreign governments. This could include making fake accounts and spreading disinformation online, especially when it comes to strategic issues like the South China Sea in the case of China and Philippines. It could also be in the form of cyber operations that harass and target foreign governments as well as foreign entities, including private companies online.
Thank you very much. With that in mind, how have hybrid threats evolved in the Indo-Pacific region in recent years, particularly in relation to cybersecurity and information operations?
So hybrid threats have been a problem going back to, it's as old as diplomacy itself, right? It's nothing new. Countries have been using gray zone tactics as a means of securing goals for centuries and millennia. In the Indo-Pacific, I can think of examples in the Cold War where hybrid threats were used in a way. The Chinese Communist Party, for example, engaged with partners, with their counterparts overseas, as well as try to engage ethnic Chinese community in, say, Southeast Asia in a way to sort of try to win them over, as well as get their support from the Chinese Communist Party in the region. In present times, again, they've really evolved with the growing uses of ICTs. The internet has made it much easier, digital technologies more broadly has made it much easier for countries to try to subvert, to try to steal information, as well as to try to spread disinformation online, right? They're now able to conduct information operations that undermine a foreign government. They're able to conduct information operations as a means of making fake narratives. And winning the narrative, of course, is always very important in any strategic setting. So this makes it complicated, for example, when countries try to deal with each other, because sometimes fake narratives can influence government officials as well. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's also the factor of cyber operations and just the general uses and misuses of cyber capabilities for economic and strategic gain, often through the uses of third parties. So a lot of intelligence agencies, as well as militaries in the Indo Pacífic, now also use hacking communities outside of their system, but still sometimes tied to their system, as a way to, again, spread disinformation, steal intellectual property, to conduct cyber espionage. And again, given the fact that there's a distance between government as well as these hackers, it provides the government with this ability to deny the accusations that they were hacking, give them a bit of plausible deniability. So cyber operations, as well as information operations, have very much changed the face of how hybrid threats are now conducted in the Pacific.
Perfect. You have already talked about new technologies, but for being more specific, what role do you think these new technologies and methods, such as 5G networks, have played in the evolution of cyber espionage tactics?
So 5G technology, in many ways, improves the way computers communicate with each other, right? I mean, one of the big buzzwords and concepts of our times is something known as Internet of Things, the ability for systems to communicate with one another more efficiently, more smoothly, and 5G facilitates all of that. Now, 5G equipment, all telecommunications equipment, actually, in theory, allows some degree of espionage or wiretapping, because any provider can also put in equipments, what are often called backdoors, into the system as a means of conducting espionage operations. So there's a lot of concern in Australia about the uses of, say, Huawei equipment, because they might be vulnerable to these, or they might be installing these kinds of backdoors into ICT systems, including Australia's 5G system, which again, is important for fast communication, fast interactions between computers. There's evidence of this in, say, the African Union headquarters in Ethiopia, where it was found that ICT equipment contained backdoors and bugs. What has been, while technically all countries can use ICT equipment as a means of conducting cyber espionage, what has been most worrying about China from the Australian perspective has been the fact that I think back in 2017, China passed a national intelligence law that required companies to cooperate with the Chinese government for all kinds of purposes. Often these purposes are very, very vaguely defined. And given that in recent years, the Chinese government has been clamping down on the power of industry, there's also this concern that Chinese companies might be coerced by the government, if not co-opted already, to provide sensitive information. So in many ways, I think the spread of 5G, it's a good thing overall for society, for the economy, because it allows computers to communicate more faster, more quickly. It also has military advantages, right? I mean, when you are a military command and headquarters communicating with forces outside of your own zone, or even forces just within your country. But the problem, again, is that 5G equipments create that opportunity for espionage.
Great. We talked about all of that here in Colombia too, when we had the 5G technology here with our country. But in your reports, Doctor, you highlighted a rise in China's cyber espionage activities targeting developing economies. What do you think makes emerging economies, such as those in Latin America, more vulnerable to these attacks? Additionally, what sectors are being most impacted?
That's a very good question. I think in many ways, developing economies have emerged as much bigger targets of cyber espionage operations more broadly. I think, especially when we think about industry and intellectual property, there's this false assumption that only advanced economies are under threat. Only America, only Western Europe, only Japan, Australia, or even China would be the big targets of economic cyber espionage, especially through corporations. But going back from around the 2010s, we are seeing an increase, actually, in the number of private entities, companies, universities, as well, of course, governments and militaries that are being targeted in cyber espionage operations by state actors. I think back in 2014, around 60% of these targets, of these private entities, were in advanced economies. But by 2020, a lot of these private entities were in the global south. They were in Latin America, they were in Southeast Asia, they were in the Middle East. Why have they been targeted? I think it's due to several reasons. Firstly, I think much of the global south has become victims of their own success. I think it's natural. You become wealthier. Therefore, you become much bigger targets of these kinds of cyber espionage operations for intellectual property. And keep in mind, when we talk about intellectual property, it's not just blueprints for the latest iPhone or blueprints for these fighter jets that are under threat. It could be as simple as meeting minutes between company and government. For example, over a contract for land. It could be as simple as well as surveyed oil fields. So oil companies are oftentimes targeted because they conduct these surveys and oil explorations in vast areas of the ocean. And this information is valuable information for a lot of foreign competitors, right? And again, going back to what I had mentioned before, China has been conducting economic cyber espionage operations going back for a while now, in part because I think there's a close relationship between government and industry. But it's not just China. Plenty of other countries do it. North Korea, Iran, Russia are some of those that do it. We see Vietnam also conducting these kinds of operations. So there's plenty of countries that are conducting it. And I think when you have the cyber capability, sometimes you're more incentivized to use all instruments, these instruments for economic and strategic gain. This is especially within a period of strategic competition, right? So becoming wealthier is one reason. Second reason is, sort of mentioned, is strategic competition. I think, again, more countries are now incentivized. There's a race to be the most innovative country in the world, especially amongst great powers. And because of this, they're using cyber tools, as well as all other kinds of instruments of national power, as a way to try to win that. And cyber tools, again, it gives you that protection, because you don't have to be in Colombia to steal Colombian IP. You can be in China, you can be in America, you can be in Brazil, you can be elsewhere. And the prospects of you getting caught is there. It's sometimes high, but the prospects of arrest is very low. I mean, what are the prospects of, say, a hacker being sponsored by the Brazilian or American governments, being extradited to Colombia because they stole intellectual property? Very low, because of that possible liability component as well. So strategic competition, wealthier economies are part of the reason why. And I think the third reason is that increasingly you can find valuable intellectual property. You don't have to go to advanced economies or very wealthy companies to just find valuable intellectual property. I think many medium-sized enterprises also have valuable intellectual property, especially since they're working together closely oftentimes with bigger corporations. So Colombia, for example, might have a up-and-coming tech startup company that is developing the next big thing in artificial intelligence or in biotechnology. It is working closely, for example, with another company overseas that may also have more advanced technologies. So Colombian enterprises naturally become market targets in these kinds of cyber espionage operations. Now, in Latin America specifically, there isn't it really does vary, I think, as to what sectors are most targeted. Naturally, government and military are still going to be the largest targets of cyber espionage operations, simply because of the valuable and sensitive information that they hold, both of economic, strategic value. But then industry is also a big target. I think, for example, energy would be a big target. ICT would be a big target. So think of IP-intensive industries, because oftentimes they're the ones really with the very, very, very valuable information that could be very useful for competitors in other countries.
That's very interesting. And with these new technologies like 5G infrastructure, the lower prices offered by Chinese providers are often hard for developing countries to turn down. We have seen this in Colombia, actually. And how can the international community, or how do you think that the international community can offer viable alternatives that address these countries' economic needs without compromising their technological security? Sorry.
Is to offer cheaper technologies, cheaper equipment as well, right? So I think, I'm from Indonesia, and I've done a lot of work on Indonesia and ICT as well, and things like technology security. And so, speaking to friends in Colombia, I very much sympathize with the problems about vendor. I think if I were in a position of a telco executive in Indonesia or in Colombia, it makes little sense to me whether Huawei or another company might be spying on me, because I think the priority is to get the technology, right? You want the technology because you're facing these urgent needs to bolster digital transformation in your countries. I mean, I think both Colombia and Indonesia see technology as being very important for economic growth, for lifting, poverty, for example, for addressing socioeconomic needs of the country, and so on. And I think it's very, I think in many ways, China, looking at it from an Indonesian/Southeast Asian perspective, China has been critical to the rapid digital transformation that Southeast Asia has seen. So it is to their credit that Huawei and ZTE have been offering cheaper equipment. Cheaper equipment that I might have to also add is in part supported by the state, right? Because China also provides, for example, export credits to support countries like Huawei, ZTE equipment. Beyond the cheapness of these products, I think the allure of a lot of Chinese telco companies is that they actually do listen to what the government needs, right? It's not just cheaper equipment; it's also things like providing capacity building and knowledge transfer. So China has provided a lot of training to engineers, to computer scientists, to other specialists for ICT in Southeast Asia through both university systems, professional systems, but also even at the vocational school level. So they're targeting all levels of society. And that's a positive thing because, again, a country like Indonesia, a country like the Philippines desperately need the human capital to support their digital transformation, right? Same thing that Colombia needs as well. So the allure of Chinese telco is there. And I think my personal view is there's no serious problem with Chinese equipment per se, because especially if you're prioritizing the development over all else, because you need to meet, there are more pressing security challenges, right? Now, technological security is interesting because, as I mentioned, telecoms equipment can technically be misused by all kinds of state actors. And that is the perspective in Indonesia, for example, where, sure, Huawei equipment, Ericsson equipment, it's all the same thing because they can be used for cyber espionage. I mean, it's true in principle. But the question is whether it's good practice, and it's harder to say, right? I think the fact that China has its intelligence law, for example, make Chinese equipment naturally a bit more complicated to use. What can the international community do? As I mentioned, I think the easiest answer is just to offer cheaper equipment. But that's not sometimes possible, especially not right now, especially given that a lot of technology is being developed in advanced economies where the price of, say, knowledge production is a lot higher. I think providing capacity building, adding the suite add-ons to providing equipment is important. Investing in knowledge transfer is also important. And knowledge transfer is different from technology transfer, right? You're not giving free technology ideas or blueprints away. You're simply helping educate an entire nation or component of a nation. And the reason that's important is because you also want stakeholders in that country to support procurements of ICT equipment. I think considering also investing more in say, developing economies can be helpful for Ericsson as well as for Nokia and other kinds of ICT vendors, because you're not only helping create, they're not only helping create expanding marketplaces, but also they're investing in future workers. They're investing in future technologies. There's a lot of innovation coming from developing economies. It's sometimes just the necessary need of resources, right? So, if Nokia and Ericsson and other ICT equipment vendors in outside of China can focus on providing those necessary resources to help educate, to help support, I guess, innovation in developing economies, that could be helpful in the long run. Because keep in mind, this is not a game just for 5-10 years. Huawei is already ahead in Global South. The focus should be on the next medium term, the longer term goals.
In your opinion, Doctor, how effective have international norms such as those ones established by the G20 in 2015 been in curbing state-sponsored cyber espionage, or what challenges do you foresee in enforcing these norms, particularly in today's geopolitical climate?
So just to give more context, the international community has actually agreed to a series of norms and informal rules as to what it is that states can and cannot do in cyberspace. Oftentimes, it's as classic as do not attack another country's critical infrastructure, which may include things like hospitals. Do not steal intellectual property, which is the G20 norm that you referred to back in 2015. The United Nations General Assembly has agreed to something known as the 11 Norms for Responsible State Behavior in Cyberspace. So that includes a lot of these kinds of agreements, in principle agreements. Cooperate with the international community to stamp down cybercrimes. Make sure that your country is not vulnerable. Your cyberspace is not being misused by criminals to steal things from in other countries or within your own country. So I think the international community has agreed on these sets of norms. Now, what ensures that norms have work in practice, of course, is two things. Firstly, I think countries actually need to not only recognize them, but also proactively advocate for them. And this means talking about them in international communities, bringing them up whenever they're misused, and also coming up with constant dialogues and discussion about what norms implementation mean. So the 11 norms for responsible state behavior in cyberspace in particular, as well as the G20 norm on not stealing intellectual property in other countries by state actors. I think they're all good ideas in theory, but what does it mean, for example, for a country not to disrupt critical infrastructure overseas, right? You require a checklist in many ways, and that's something currently being worked on. The international community, regional organizations as well as some members of the international community are working on this. So including, for example, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is working on what's called a norms checklist, a practical norms checklist. So recognizing the norm is important, advocating is important. The second thing is also figure out ways in which you can actually really enforce the norm. Or, beyond advocating, how do you punish, countries that do not comply with these norms? Now that's even tougher. I think the international community, in many ways, very few countries actually conduct what is often called as countermeasures or attribution. So attribution refers to saying, hey, you are being bad because you have been using your cyber capabilities to attack my critical infrastructure during peacetime. Or countermeasures include, for example, attacking back a country or a computer system in another country that has been conducting cyber operations. So few countries do that to a large extent because of capacity issues. Right now, attribution is largely conducted by more cyber mature countries, particularly in the West. So it includes, for example, NATO, US, Australia, Japan, and so on. But I think for the most part, countries struggle to do that because of diplomatic reasons. You don't want to upset the country that has attacked you in cyberspace, in part because you don't know if it's really them, as in the government. And secondly, cyber oftentimes is not seen as a priority in foreign relations. It's still, say, priority number 4, or not number 4 actually, probably number 10. So if you have a free trade agreement coming up with another country, you're going to prioritize that way above any form of cyber attack that they may have conducted. So thinking about how countries individually can enforce norms, it's again, I think at the end of the day, it comes back to sort of enforcing your own capabilities. I think in many Latin American countries, along with in Southeast Asia as well, for example, that we have examined, there's a natural dislike of confrontation, which is completely fine. So rather than attribution per se or countermeasures per se, work on the cybersecurity ecosystem in your country. And this means engaging with industry and others to not only make sure that they have the capacity to be resilient against cyber operations, but also as a means of promoting these norms. Because I think even internally within countries, there's a lack of discussion of what it is that state actors and non-state actors can and cannot do in cyberspace beyond the usual things, right? Especially state actors, there's oftentimes not enough restraint.
That's very interesting. You just have talked about some recommendations on what could countries do, but if we talk specifically about emerging economies such as Colombia, do you think there are specific strategies that they should implement to enhance their cybersecurity resilience and safeguard their intellectual property, along with what you already told us?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think there are several things that emerging economies can do, bearing in mind that emerging economies have many problems with resource constraints. And this is not an emerging economy problem only. Advanced economies also struggle with this. Australia, for example, has a human capital issue when it comes to cybersecurity. So it's a global problem. There are global challenges. But countries like Colombia, for example, can firstly recognize that, can do several things. Firstly, can recognize that innovation is also under threat. The IP-intensive sectors are also under threat. I think a lot of the approaches of cybersecurity agencies right now, because we're only laying the foundations recently, right, has been to focus on ensuring the security of critical infrastructure. Now, critical infrastructure can technically encompass also IP-intensive industries. I mean, you may have energy, for example, listed as a critical infrastructure. But then oftentimes the conversation is more about how do you just practice basic cyber hygiene. I mean, there are minimum standards, of course, that have to be met. I think the conversation has to move away from just critical infrastructure, protection of critical infrastructure, to really protection of ideas. This is a conversation that has to happen in many emerging economies because, again, emerging economies are under threat. Private entities in emerging economies are under threat. Also think about what industries in your country, for example, would be the future sources of growth. What is Colombia known for when it comes to innovation and science and technology? Is it more advanced compared to many other countries when it comes to biotechnology, to agriculture? Is there technologies in Colombia or ideas in Colombia that could be coveted by foreign governments or foreign entities and when thinking about this, naturally one becomes more naturally one also thinks about the cyber risk mitigation efforts as well, right? For example, biotechnology. If biotechnology is identified then as a critical industry, then the Colombian government may invest more in protecting the biotechnology industry compared to other industries. So these are just like fairly straightforward things that governments can do. Involves, for example, government, the cybersecurity apparatus engaging closely with the biotechnology industry, sharing, for example, relatively confidential information about the cyber threat environment. So this is, for example, what the Japanese government does. The National Police engages with the automobile industry as well as other innovative industries to highlight, this is what we are seeing within the cyber threat environment. Your companies are under threat. Make sure that you protect these kinds of intellectual property. So government industry cooperation is actually quite fundamental to protecting intellectual property. And also, I think, working together internationally, as well as engaging other countries on cybersecurity. I think cybersecurity has been lifted up in the priorities of foreign policy. And what this means is several things. Firstly, whenever requesting capacity building or education cooperation, prioritize cybersecurity. Figure out if there's a way to get more Colombians to study cybersecurity, either overseas through scholarships or domestically. Get companies, cybersecurity companies, to also work closely with government to set up centers of excellence domestically. So there are many ways in which cybersecurity can be lifted up the priority list, right? Information sharing is also another method of cooperation. That means sort of having a discussion on what it is that we're all seeing together. Now, there's also the other method is to, the other good practice is also to work multilaterally to, again, promote norms. I think it's important for the regional organizations that Colombia is a part of to focus on promoting the 11 norms responsible state behavior in cyberspace, the norm not to steal intellectual property from other countries. And what this means is not just, it can simply be several things. Firstly, you can incorporate into agreements or joint communiques, discuss it at cybersecurity forums, but also I think create workshops, working groups, to have a discussion on the subject. How can the countries of Latin America, how can the countries of South America work together closely to promote a more secure cyberspace? Because I think, South America, Latin America, a bit like Southeast Asia, is a collection of small, medium, larger sized states, right? I think there's a lot of power in cooperating multilaterally. And I think for our country, for these kinds of countries, norms matter a lot more, right? Because you want to constrain the powers of bigger states, right? Especially, or countries with more advanced cyber capabilities. So there's a vested interest to work together to figure out can we prevent the misuses of cyber capabilities in more cyber mature countries.
Okay, that was very interesting. Thank you very much, Dr. Priyandita. We greatly appreciate your sharing your knowledge with us today and highlighting the risks posed by China's technology and the ways we can mitigate them here in Colombia. We would like to thank the Australian Embassy and ASPI also for fostering this important discussion and providing such valuable insights for us. To all those watching us today, we hope you continue following our webinar series. With this session, we have had 3 interviews on this topic, and we will be hosting one more in collaboration with the Australian Embassy. We also invite you to visit our social media, icp.colombia, and explore our content in political, security, and economic issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrea.